Welcome back, everyone. After extended Bein Hazmanim, extended vacation, I'm excited to be back. I hope you're excited. I missed giving the shiur. I hope that you missed participating in the shiur. Okay, we're up to Parsha Shoftim. And it's hard to find a general theme sometimes in the Parshas of Sefer Dvarim. But I think Shoftim really is about Shoftim. And it really is about justice. It really is about systems of governance. It comes up over and over again. And I'd like to pick out today's Rambans more or less on the theme of justice and how God runs the world, or how we as God's representatives run the world. And let's start with a really, really famous pasuk. It's Perek Yud Zayin, pasuk Yud Aleph, and the Torah tells us as follows. Al piat. Well, let's back up for a second just so we get a sense. Ki palei michad davar lamishpat. Right, if something is unclear to the judges of your town, v'kamta v'alisa lamakom sheivcha Hashem elkecha bo. You go up to Yerushalayim, to the base in Agadol, v'atar la'kohanim ha'leviyim ve'la shofet asher b'yamim hahem. You come to the judges who live then. V'asita al pi hadavar sheyagidu lecha yamin u'smol. V'asita al pi hadavar sheyagidu lecha min ha'makom hahu asher yivcha Hashem v'shamarta la'asot kechol asher yarucha. You have to listen to everything that they tell you, and here it comes. It sounds like the same pasuk. Al pi Torah asher yarucha. V'al hamishpat asher yamru lecha ta'aseh lo tasur min hadavar asher yagidu lecha yamin u'smol. Right, so lo tasur is the source for almost every drabanan and the idea and the authority of Chazal. But what does it mean, lo tasur min hadavar asher yagidu lecha yamin u'smol? So this is actually a relatively famous drasha. Rashi talks about it, and we need to understand it. So, as soon as I find it here, so the Ramban quotes Rashi, Afilu im omar lecha al yamin shu small or al small shu yamin, lashon Rashi. Right, that's the drasha of Rashi based on Gemaros, and now the Ramban explains. Right, as often happens in the Ramban, he doesn't disagree with Rashi, he just feels like it needs to be fleshed out. V'inyano, what's the idea? Afilu tachshov belibcha shehem toim. V'hadavar pashut be'einecha kasher ta yodea bein yimincha lismolcha ta'aseh k'mitzvatam. Right? You're so sure that they're mistaken, you're as sure as if somebody said to you, your right hand was your left hand and your left hand was your right hand. Says the Ramban, there are things that you know, and they tell you otherwise. No, you have to listen to them. Va'al tomar, don't say, Eich ochal ha'chelev ha'gamur hazeh, o aharog ha'ish hanaki hazeh. Right? They told me that this pork is really lamb chops. He says, but you know it's pork. So how can you do that? Okay, he says, nevertheless, or kill this person. Bezdin tells you to kill this person, but you think he's innocent. No, ta'aseh k'mitzvatam. Va'al tomar eich ochal ha'chelev ha'gamur hazeh o aharog ha'ish hanaki hazeh, aval tomar kach tziva oti ha'adon ha'mitzaveh al ha'mitzvot she'e'eseh b'chol mitzvotav k'chol asher yoruni ha'omdim lefanav b'makom she'yivchar v'al mashma'ut da'atam natan li ha'torah afilu yiteh. He said, no, you should say to yourself, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave me the Torah al das Chazal. Right? If they tell me otherwise, they are reflecting the truth of the Torah. Now, how can that be? Right? If you think they're wrong, so, this is a big problem for us. How do you suspend judgment when somebody tells you something and you're sure that it's wrong and it doesn't make any sense to you? So says the Ramban, no, they're not wrong. Let's see what he says. V'zeh kinyan Rabbi Yoshua, he paraphrases the Gemara in Rabban Gamliel, b'yom ha'kippurim shechol yot b'cheshbono. Right, what's the famous story? The famous story is Rabban Gamliel was the Nasi, and he said it was Rosh Chodesh, and Rabbi Yoshua thought otherwise. And Rabbi Yoshua had a different calculation. And literally, Rabban Gamliel said to Rabbi Yoshua, come to see me on the day, come to see me with your wallet, literally get in your car, drive to my house, and have lunch with me on the day that you think is Yom Kippur. Okay, and there the Gemara says that Rabbi Akiva comforted Rabbi Yoshua, his Rebbe, and he said, you taught us, right, that we're supposed to listen to Chazal, and that's the example the Ramban brings. V'hutzrach b'mitzvah hazot tzorech gadol ma'od. Says the Ramban, this isn't just substantive. This is also procedural. It's a really, really important mitzvah. Ki ha-Torah nitna lanu bichtav. The Torah was given to us in writing, which basically means it's immutable. It can't be changed. It can't be updated. V'yaduahu shelo yishtavu hadeyot b'chol hadvarim hanoladim. And it can't be that in every generation they agree on the proper interpretation of the Torah shebichsav. V'hinei yirbu ha'machlokot v'ta'aseh ha'Torah kama Torot. So if there's no rule that says to listen to Chazal, even if you think that they're wrong, he says there's going to be enormous machloksim. Every generation is going to be divided on how they understand the pasuk. V'chatach lanu hakatuv hadin shenishma lebeitin hagadol ha'omed lifnei Hashem b'makom she'ivchar b'chol ma sheyomru lanu b'feirush haTorah. Says the Ramban, and we have to be medayik in his lashon. The mitzvah is to listen to Chazal b'chol ma sheyomru lanu b'feirush haTorah. This, I think, the Ramban is going back to a machlokus that he had with the Rambam in terms of what's the scope of Chazal's power? What's the scope of this pasuk? So the Ramban limits it. He says the power of Chazal and the prohibition to disagree with Chazal is b'chol ma sheyomru lanu b'feirush haTorah. The Rambam thinks no, it's with regard to everything, right? Which is the famous question of the Ramban when he asks the Rambam, so what's then the difference? Why do we say Sfeika d'oraisa l'chumra, Sfeika d'Rabbanan l'kula? Every d'Rabbanan becomes a d'oraisa. That's a separate issue, and that we can deal with another time. But that's the machlokas Ramban and Rambam. The Ramban thinks that this pasuk is limited to Perush HaTorah. The Rambam thinks it's broader than that. Okay, let's continue. Bein shekiblu perusho aid mipi aid Moshe mipi agvura. Whether they got it literally halach al Moshe misinai. Moshe Rabbeinu came down from Har Sinai and he said, "Ayin tachas ayin" does not mean what the pasuk says. It means mamon. I got that from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. O she'amru kein lefi mashmud haTorah o kavanatam. Or Chazal looked at the pasuk and that's what they think it means. Ki al hadad shelahem hu noten lahem haTorah. Right? It's kilo. God is giving us the Torah on condition that we accept the interpretation of Chazal. Afilu yeh beinecha kimachlif hayamin bismol. Even if in your view they're confusing right and left. V'chol shekain sheyesh lecha lachshov she'em omrim al yamin shehu yamin. And obviously, in most cases, we think that Chazal are right. So certainly, if you have to paskin like them when they say yamin is small, so certainly when they say yamin is yamin. Ki ruach Hashem, and now the Ramban gets to something substantive, right? It's not just a procedural rule. Yes, it's procedural. We can't each decide what the Torah means. We have to have a final arbiter, and that's Chazal, and that's the Sanhedrin HaGadol, and that's why we go to Yerushalayim. But then he says the point is, Ki ruach Hashem al mishartei mikdasho. No, God's Spirit, some kind of ruach Hashem, some kind of divine understanding, is given over to Bezdin HaGadol. V'lo ya'azov et chasidav la'olam nishmru min ha'ta'ot u'min ha'michshal. God will make sure that Bezdin HaGadol doesn't make a mistake. It reminds me, and as I say this, I think we did this once before, right? Rav Lichtenstein talked about the power of Chazal, and he quoted a certain justice of the Supreme Court who said, we're not final because we're right because we're final. Meaning, there's no place to go. If the Supreme Court paskins, you can't appeal it to some other court. So by definition, they're right. And Rav Aaron said, I remember, he said, with respect to Chazal, we'd like to think that both things are true. They're right because they're final, but they're also final because they're right. That both things are true, and that by definition, Chazal is right, but that HaKadosh Baruch Hu guides them in a way that makes sure that in substance, they're right also. Okay, so that's the first idea in the Ramban, the first idea about how the court system works, that as a procedural matter, Bezdin HaGadol has to be accepted, otherwise there'll be many, many Torot, and that we can't have. But as a substantive matter, we believe that they're right. We believe that God will guide them in a way that will lead to the right result. Okay, let's go on. One of the most, it's hard for me to come to a word. where there are two different ways to read a pasuk, and each is expressed in the Rishonim, and each is expressed in the Gemara, frankly, and it's not really resolved. And that's the mitzvah, I say in air quotes, of a melech. So says the Torah in Perek Yud Zayin. The Torah tells us as follows: Perek Yud Zayin Pasuk Yudalet. Ki tavo la'aretz asher Adonai Elohecha noten lecha lach v'yirishta v'yashavta ba v'amarta asima alai melech kechol hagoyim asher svivotai. Right. So the question is, what does it mean? The phrase kechol hagoyim asher svivotai, we have to be honest with ourselves. That's usually said in the negative, right? When the Torah says, I'm going to say to myself, I want X because all the other goyim have X, almost always the answer is no, don't do that. Lo tilmad la'asod kitoavot hagoyim ha'ele. That theme keeps coming up in Sefer Dvarim. And so there are those who say, there's a sheet like that in the Gemara, prominently the Abarbanel was terrified of monarchies, and I think it's hard to distinguish that from the fact that the Abarbanel, lived in Spain. He lived through the Gerush Sfarad, right? He was the treasury minister for Ferdinand and Isabel, two huge anti-Semites and evil and bad people, and he saw what could happen, and he was very much against it. The Rambam, on the other hand, and as we'll see the Ramban as well, think this is a mitzvah satorah. Why does it say Kechol Hagoyim Asher Svivotai? We'll see that in a second. Okay, let's just continue reading in the Psukim. Says the Torah, and if we didn't have the first pasuk, the second pasuk is clear. Som tasim alecha melech asher yivchar Adonai Elohecha bo mikerav achecha tasim alecha melech lo tuchal latet alecha ish nachri asher lo achicha hu. If it was just pasuk bet, we'd have no doubt this is a mitzvah, right? It's a command. Som tasim alecha melech. It's pasuk aleph that throws us off. So let's see what the Ramban says. V'amarta asima alai melech, says the Ramban. Aldat rabotenu kimo vitomar or emor asima alai melech v'hi mitzvat aseh. No, says the Ramban, despite the lashon, it's a mitzvat aseh sheyichayev otanu lomar kein achar Yerusha v'yeshiva. Not just that you might say, not just that you can say, you should say. After you're settled in the land, you need a king. Kilashon va'asita ma'akel legagecha v'zulatam. The Ramban says it's often the case in the Torah, and when you think about it, there are words that might be imperatives, and they might be, predictions about the future. You could read the pasuk to say, one day this is going to happen. Not that God wants it to happen, but one day you're going to say, I want a king like other nations. V'hizkir va'amarta ki mitzvah sheyavo lifnei hakohanim haleviyim vel hashofet. No, says the Ramban. It says va'amarta, meaning it's a mitzvah that you appear before the kohanim, the leviyim, before the judges. V'yomru lahem ritzonenu shenasim aleinu melech. You're supposed to express yourself to them and say, it's our will, it's our desire that we have a king. Okay, let's go on in the Ramban. Ulefi da'ati od shegam ze mirimizot umar mirizim botav. It's a remez al ha'atidot. The Ramban wants to have it both ways. On the one hand, he wants the imperative, som tasim alecha. It's a mitzvah d'oraisa that you have a king. But on the other hand, he says the lashon does sound a little bit like a prediction or like a nevuah. Shekein haya, and says around that's exactly what happened. Kishesha'alu lahem et Shaul, when they asked that Shaul become their king, amru lishmuel, si malanu melech l'shaftenu kechol hagoyim. Literally, it's a bit of a nevuah, and there are often these parashos in the Torah. It's next week or the week after where the parsha of Tshuva comes up, where you could read it either as a nevuah, that one day this will happen, or you could read it as an imperative, as a command, that God wants this to happen. So here the Ramban kind of has it both ways. He says it's a mitzvah, but it's a mitzvah that's also a prediction, and he says it came true. That's exactly what the Jews said to Shmuel. V'chein katuv sham, v'hayinu gam anachnu kechol hagoyim. V'shaftenu malkenu. Yeah, we'll be like all the other nations of the world. We'll be ruled by a king. Ki matam shetomar Torah b'mitzvah kechol hagoyim asher svivotav. Right? The Torah never tells us in a positive way, you'll be like the other nations. But says the Ramban on this point, that's the point. Ve'ein Yisrael ru'uyim l'lamed mehem. Generally speaking, we're not supposed to learn from the other nations of the world. It's an exception to the rule. We're not supposed to be jealous of the evil things that they do. It's both a mitzvah saseh, a command, and it's a hint to the future. So therefore, he says, the Torah writes it b'lashon beinoni. Lashon beinoni generally in the Ramban is a grammatical term, right? There's avar, there's atid, and lashon beinoni is probably something in between. But here the Ramban borrows that term to say the Torah wrote it b'lashon beinoni v'amarta asima alai melech, in a way, in a kind of an in-between way, where you could read it as a prophecy, you could read it as a nevuah, and you could also read it as a command. And the Ramban thinks it's both. It's an absolute mitzvah saseh min haTorah to have a king, and it's also a prediction that in the future it's going to happen in a way, along the way that God describes it here, and that's exactly what happened. When they first asked for a king, you know, they told Shmuel they wanted a king, kechol hagoyim. It's literally how the Torah explained it. Now, what the Ramban doesn't leave explained is that Shmuel was angry about it, and Shmuel was disappointed. And generally speaking, we think to ourselves, when you have a Shmuel Hanavi, there's no need for a king. And really then they're doing it just to be like the other Goyim. Hard to know. The Rambam thinks that unifying the people is a value, right? It's not just that having a king is a good thing because there'll be a king. No. The Rambam also uses the similar language when he talks about the Melech HaMashiach, that he'll unify the people, that the people can rally around a king. In the old days in particular, right? If you were going to war, you needed to rally around something. You didn't rally around ideas of democracy or fairness or whatever. You rallied around a person, and that's what brought the people together. And so for the Rambam, it's pretty obvious why he thinks it's such a great idea. I think the Ramban is kind of walking a fine line. He thinks the Rambam is right, that this is a mitzvah. I think that's because of the second pasuk, because of Som Tasim Alech HaMelech, which is really definitive. The problem is the first pasuk, which sounds like something bad, and the Ramban thinks it's not that it's something bad, it's a prediction, and it's exactly what played out in the time of Shmuel and in the time of Shaul. Okay, so much for kings, although I want to point out also that, you know, when we talk about does God care about a system of government, it's really possible to say from this pasuk and from this parsha and to say, yes, God cares very, very much. So would God say that the modern state of Israel, or when Mashiach comes, or when from Jews are our decision-making body here, we should have a king? I don't think so. But that's for a different discussion. But the idea that God doesn't care about government, I think, is belied by the parsha of Melech in this week's parsha. Okay, let's do one more thing. Let's do the idea of Eidim. And the idea that al pishnai meidim yakum davar. Let's go to pasuk Yutes. Let's see if I could get it quickly. Okay, let's read this together. First, the Torah says, "Lo yakum eid echad beish l'chol avon l'chol chatat b'chol chet asher yechta al pishnei eidim o al pish shlosha eidim yakum davar." No, the gold standard in halacha is shnei eidim. Right? If you had a fight between 100 eidim and 2 eidim constitute the truth. Again, if they're cross-examined and the court accepts them, but there's nothing more true. That's a standard that the Torah establishes, that al pi shnei eidim establishes the fact. Okay? Now, okay, I'm skipping a few psukim. V'darshu Shoftim heitev. There are witnesses. V'hinei eid sheker ha'eid sheker anabachiv. Let's say the court determines that it's false testimony. Va'asitem lo, not just false testimony. The Gemara explains they're eidim zomimim. What are eidim zomimim? It's not just that people contradict their testimony. It's that they testified that on the third day of Elul, which was a Wednesday, at 12 o'clock, we saw the following. And two other Eidim come and testify that no, but on the third day of Elul, on that Wednesday at 2 o'clock, you were having lunch with us in some place completely different. You couldn't have seen it. You were with someplace else. Those are called Eidim Zomimim. And the Torah tells us a huge chiddush. V'asitem lo ka'asher zamam lasot la'achiv. We believe the second set of witnesses. U'bi'arta ra mikirbecha. And we punish the first witnesses. How do we punish them? We punish them with the punishment that they tried to give to the defendants in the case. Now, how does that work? So let's read the Ramban in Pasuk Yud Ches v'dashu Shoftim heitev v'hinei eid sheker ha'eid. Lo pireish hakatuv eich yodea shu eid sheker. Right? If two witnesses are the gold standard, and two witnesses came to Bezdin and they testified that X committed a murder at such and such place, on such and such time, on such and such date, now two other witnesses come and say, no, you were with us on that day. So how do you know who to believe? So says the Ramban, Lo pireish hakatuv eich yeda shehu eid sheker. Ki bihiyot inyan bishnei eidim shemeidim ala davar afil yavo mea v'yakchishu otam lo yitbaresh sheker anu. Right? It's not a question of 100 witnesses are against two witnesses, so therefore we believe 100 witnesses. Two witnesses is the gold standard. That's as good as it gets. So what's going on? V'lo nuchal lomar sheba harug biraglav. And you can't say that the guy they testified was killed walks into Bezdin. Ki lo yomar b'zeh v'darshu hashoftim heitev. Because the lashon v'darshu hashoftim doesn't make sense. If the guy's alive, so clearly they lied. Va'al kein ba hakabbalah hane'emenet upeusha ki hazama tihiyeh ki shamru v'halo biyom planu imanu hayitem. That's why Chazal interpret the pasuk differently than the simple pshat. Chazal come and say, no, it's not 2 against 2. The second set of Eidim testify that the first set of Eidim were with them at that time. Vahatam, the reason is, mipnei she'edut hazo hi al gufam shel Eidim. Vehem einam ne'emanim al atzmam, lomar lo asinu kach. It's not 2 against 2. That's exactly the point. Says the Ramban, 2 against 2 we would not be able to machriya it according to the second set of Eidim. He says, no. The two people testified that Reuven killed Shimon. The second people don't testify whether Reuven killed Shimon or not. They simply testify that the two Eidim who said that Reuven killed Shimon couldn't have been there. They couldn't have seen it. So it's not 2 against 2 because the first Eidim can't. They're testifying about themselves, right? Which we don't believe them, right? They're nogim b'davar. So says the Ramban, that's exactly why the Torah says they're Eidim Zomimim. They're not correcting the first two Eidim. They're not contradicting them. They're testifying about something totally different. You happened to be having lunch with us in a different place at that time, so you couldn't possibly have seen it. We don't know anything about Reuven killing Shimon. We don't know if Shimon's alive. We don't know. We're not saying anything about that. We're simply testifying that you were having lunch with us at that time in another place, and so you couldn't possibly have seen it. They're not saying anything about the substance of the case. And says the Ramban, not as clearly as maybe we would have wanted to, but the Ramban says that's the secret of Eidim Zomimim. The whole point of Eidim Zomimim is it's not 2 against 2. The second Eidim are testifying about something completely different. They're testifying that you were with us at that time. They're not testifying about the substance. Yes, 2 is the gold standard, but the Chiddush HaTorah is if 2 other witnesses come and testify that the first 2 couldn't possibly be telling the truth, not because they know in substance that Reuven didn't kill Shimon, and not because Shimon is alive and so it's silly. That can't be. But he says, no, here the point is, they're simply saying you were having lunch with us at that time in a restaurant, which precluded the possibility that you actually saw the murder. And the Chiddush HaTorah is that in that case, we believe the second set of Eidim and not the first set of Eidim. Now, one more detail in Eidim Zomim, maybe we'll say it outside because we're going to run out of time. The Pasuk says, let's read it again, Pasuk Yutes. Va'asitem lo ka'asher zamam la'asot la'achiv. And the Gemara is clear, ka'asher zamam v'lo ka'asher asa. Meaning, if Bezdin carried out the testimony of the first Eidim, and they testified that Reuven killed Shimon, and in fact, the Bezdin puts Reuven to death, and then two other Eidim come and say, you couldn't possibly have seen that case, you were with us at lunch, we don't conclude that the first two Eidim are Eidim Zomim and that they're lying. Now, why is that? And says the Ramban, because the Ramban says God wouldn't let the Bezdin make that mistake. If Bezdin actually put Reuven to death, there's every reason to believe that Bezdin was correct, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu cares about our system of justice, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is involved in our system of justice. And just like when Chazal paskin something, we think that Chazal would help them, right? Lo tasur yaminu small. We think that God is involved. He's not just sitting it out. He wouldn't let them make such a massive mistake. Says the Ramban here too. God wouldn't let them kasher zaman v'lo kasher asa, because if Bezdin killed Reuven, there's every reason to believe that Reuven deserved to be killed. But if the second Eidim come before Reuven is killed, then we say, okay, Reuven is a tzaddik, and these people are coming to save his life because he didn't do it, right? But if Bezdin kills him, God doesn't want Bezdin to make a mistake like that. And says the Ramban even more so, God wouldn't let Bezdin make a mistake like that. The secret of ka'asher zamam v'lo ka'asher asa is not a technicality. The Torah is saying God wouldn't let this happen. God wouldn't let the Bezdin kill the wrong person. If God let Bezdin kill that person, it's evidence of the fact that these are not Eidim Zomim. It's evidence of the fact that we should believe the first two Eidim. And we do. But if they didn't, then it makes complete sense that the second two Eidim who say you were having lunch with us at that time, you couldn't possibly have seen this, that they're telling the truth, and that the first two Eidim are wrong, and that God is saving Reuven's life, and that in fact Reuven did not commit the crime. Okay, so we saw a range of, court-related, justice-related Rambans. Lo tasur yaminu small, the Ramban saying there, lo tasur yaminu small, meaning that we don't think Bezdin would make such a terrible mistake. If you're convinced that they're saying that right is left and left is right, says the Ramban, no. First of all, procedurally, we need Bezdin to be the final word. Second of all, believe that God is helping them and that for whatever reason you're making a mistake. Same thing about appointing a king, right? The Ramban thinks that in fact the pasuk is telling us it's a good thing and it's a mitzvah satorah. So what's the first pasuk talking about? Asim al melech kichol hagoyim asher svivotai. It's a bit of a prophecy, right? When the Jews came to ask for shol, that's the lashon that they used. So ki'ilu, the Torah is telling us, I think the Torah is telling us that it's a pretty complicated thing, but I think the Torah cares very, very much about our system of government. And finally, Eidim Zomimim, it's not 2 against 2. 2 are testifying about the substance of the case. The second 2 are not testifying about the substance of the case. They're testifying that the first 2 could not have possibly been witnesses to what they claim. We think the second 2 are correct, even though 2 Eidim is the gold standard in halacha, and therefore we go with the second 2, unless it turns out that Bezdin has already carried out the judgment as testified by the first 2. And then shockingly we say, says the Ramban, Bezdin wouldn't make a mistake like that. God wouldn't let them kill the wrong person, and therefore the halacha is ka'asher zamam v'lo ka'asher asa. Great to be back. That's all the time we have for today. Yashkach to everybody, and see you, God willing, next week. Shabbat Shalom.